Bramwell Voss didn't knock. That was the first thing Mara Winslow noticed, not the cold air that slammed through her front door, not the two men flanking him like fence posts, not even the rolled papers he slapped onto her kitchen table, hard enough to rattle her coffee tin. He just walked in, right through her door, into her home, like the walls belonged to him already. Like she was furniture he hadn't decided to move yet. "You've got 30 days, he said, not even looking at her. He was reading the room instead, the cracked window she'd stuffed with rags, the patched ceiling, the stack of firewood that wasn't going to last the week. Calculating. After that, I file the lien and the county takes the deed. Eli was standing in the doorway to the back hall, 10 years old, and already learning what it meant when men like Voss walked into a room. Mara put her hand out behind her without turning around, and her son stepped back into the shadow. If this kind of story moves something in you, the kind where ordinary people refuse to break, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens between Mara Winslow and the wounded stranger she pulls from the snow is not the kind of thing you'll want to miss halfway through. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the night it all began. The wind off the Nebraska plains in January of 1887 was not the kind of wind that inconvenienced you. It was the kind that got into your bones and stayed there. It came down from the North Flat and Mean, and it hit Blackthorn Ranch from every direction at once, because there was nothing between the ranch and Canada except frozen grass and bad luck. Mara had been awake since 4 in the morning. She didn't sleep past 4 anymore. Hadn't since Thomas left, walked out 18 months ago, with nothing but a bedroll and some excuse about California, and she hadn't heard a word from him since. The ranch was hers, now. The debt was hers. The broken windmill and the collapsing north fence and the 7 head of cattle that hadn't been enough to start with were all hers. And Eli was hers, which was the only part of that list that didn't feel like a stone tied around her ankle. She was checking the stove when she heard him. Not a knock. Not a voice. Just a sound wrong low, coming from the direction of the gate. Like something falling that shouldn't have fallen. Mara stood still for 3 full seconds, listening. Cattle dogs were quiet. That meant it wasn't a predator. But it wasn't nothing either. She took the rifle from above the door. She didn't light a lantern. Light made you a target before you could see what you were looking at. She opened the door into the wind and crossed the yard in the dark with the rifle up, following the sound until her boot hit something solid. Not something. Someone. A man was down against the gatepost. Big man, heavy, one arm wrapped around the post, like he'd grabbed it on the way to the ground. Couldn't see his face, just the shape of him, the way he was breathing wrong, the dark spreading through his coat on the left side. "Hey," she crouched. "Hey, you alive?" A sound, not words. But air moving through him, which meant yes. She stood up and looked back at the house. Thought about Eli asleep inside. Thought about what Thomas would have said. "Leave him, Mara. You don't know who he is. You don't bring strangers inside. Not out here." Thomas had been afraid of everything, which was maybe why he'd left. Even fear could run out of patience eventually. She thought about the man's breathing. "All right," she said to herself mostly. All right. Getting him inside almost broke her back. He was conscious enough to push with his legs some of the time, which helped, and unconscious enough the rest of the time that she was essentially dragging 190 pounds of dead weight across frozen ground. She hit the porch railing with his boot, and he made a sound sharp, involuntary, and she stopped. "That hurt?" she said. "Yes," he said. First word he'd spoken. "Good. Means you're still in there. Keep moving." She got him through the door and down onto the rug in front of the stove. Eli appeared in the hallway, eyes wide, holding a candle. "Who is that?" "Don't know yet. Go get the tin box under my bed, the one with the linen strips, and bring me the kettle." "Mama Eli, box and kettle, go." She got his coat open. The wound was on his left side. Below the ribs a bullet hole, clean entry, no exit she could find, which was bad. The bleeding had slowed, which was either good or meant he'd lost enough already that his body was running out of options. She packed it with linen and pressed hard while he made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and his head fell back against the floorboards. "Don't you pass out on me," she said. What's your name? Nothing. I said, what's your name? I've got a child in this house and a bullet in your side, and I need to know who I'm dealing with. His jaw moved. Rourke, a pause. Gideon Rourke. Where did this happen? Road, who shot you? Silence. She pressed harder on the wound, and he sucked in air sharply. I'm not doing that to punish you, she said. I'm doing it because if I don't, you bleed out on my floor and I have to explain a dead stranger to my 10-year-old. Who shot you? Don't know the man's name. She didn't believe him. But the bleeding was her problem right now, not the lying. Eli brought the box and the kettle and stood at the edge of the rug, watching with that particular stillness children develop when they understand that something serious is happening, and that noise from them would make it worse. Mara cleaned the wound as well as she could, repacked it tight, and wrapped him the way her mother had taught her, firm, overlapping, nothing sloppy. Help me get him to the cot in the back room, she told Eli. Mama, he's huge. Yes, he is. Come take his feet. It took 20 minutes. It should have taken 5. At the end of it, Mara's hands were shaking and Eli was breathing hard, and Gideon Rourke was on the cot with a blanket over him and a fever already starting behind his eyes. Mara stood over him and held the lantern up. He was hard-looking. That was the word for it, not the kind of hard that meant cruel, but the kind that meant a long time of difficult things had compressed the softness out of him. A scar along his jaw, hands that had worked, big shoulders that had carried. Whatever he was, he'd earned it with his body. She lowered the lantern and went back to the kitchen. Is he going to die? Eli asked from behind her. Not tonight if I can help it. Why did you bring him in? She thought about that. She poured herself half a cup of coffee that had been sitting since midnight and drank it cold. Because I could hear him, she finally said, and that seemed like reason enough. He burned through the next 2 days. High fever, the kind that makes a person say things they wouldn't say otherwise, fragments of sentences, names, something that sounded like an argument with someone who wasn't there. Mara sat with him when she could and worked the ranch when she had to, which meant Eli was checking on him twice an hour, with instructions to come get her if the breathing changed. On the second afternoon, she heard him say a woman's name. Said it twice, soft like a question. She didn't ask about it later. On the morning of the 3rd day, she came in with broth and found him sitting up. He looked at her, really looked focused and present in a way he hadn't been for 2 days. Like he was taking inventory of where he was and how he'd gotten there and deciding what it meant. You're the one who found me, he said. My son found you. I brought you inside. He looked at the room. At the single window, the bare floor, the patched ceiling above him. This is your place, Blackthorn Ranch. Yes, a pause. Your husband, not here. He seemed to accept that without needing the details. How long? 3 days. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, but something near it. You should have left me at the gate. Probably, she said, and held out the broth. Can you hold a cup or do I need to do that too? He took it from her. His hands weren't shaking, which was a better sign than she'd expected. She watched him drink and didn't ask the questions yet. There would be time, or there wouldn't, and that would be its own answer. On the 5th day, Eli made the mistake of telling Gideon Rourke that the north fence had been down since October. Mara came around the corner of the house to find the man she'd been nursing for 5 days standing outside in the cold, with Eli pointing toward the far pasture. Gideon was still pale, still moving carefully, but he was up and dressed and listening to her sons explain the layout of a ranch he'd never seen before, with the specific focused expression of a man who fixed things. You should be inside, she said. I've been inside 5 days. You've been unconscious for most of those. Still counts. He turned to look at her. Your fence is down along the north edge. Cattle are drifting. I know where my cattle are. You've got 3 head about a 1/4 mile northeast that don't know they're still yours. She'd known about 2 of them. She said nothing. I can help, he said. You can barely stand. Standing's not what fences need. He held her gaze. Steady. Not pushing, not pleading, just stating a fact and leaving it with her. I'm not going to lie in that room while your place falls down around you. That's not, he stopped. Started again. That's not something I'm willing to do. Eli was watching both of them with the alert, patient expression of a child who understood that something was being decided. Mara looked at the man. She looked at the fence line he couldn't actually see from here, but somehow knew was wrong. She thought about the 14 other things on Blackthorn that needed 2 hands and a strong back, and hadn't had either in 18 months. "You opened that wound," she said. "I'm not sewing it shut again." "Fair enough. And you tell me who shot you." The silence that came after that was long enough to have weight. He turned and looked at the empty pasture. "A man's dead," he said. "In another county. There was a fight. It wasn't planned. It wasn't. I didn't go there to kill anyone." He paused. "But I didn't stay to answer for it either. I ran." She let that sit. "So you're running," she said. "I was." He looked back at her. "Right now I'm standing in your yard offering to fix your fence." She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she turned to Eli. "Show him where we keep the tools." Gideon Rourke worked like a man trying to pay a debt he didn't know the exact amount of. He started with the fence because that was the most urgent and the most visible, the thing she'd been trying to manage alone for months. He went out in the cold every morning and came back at noon with dirt on his hands and an assessment 3 posts need replacing, not just resetting. The wires stretched past fixing in the southwest corner. The gate latch is the wrong size for the hardware it's mounted on. Somebody improvised. Thomas improvised a lot of things, Mara said, not meaning to say it out loud. Gideon just nodded and wrote down what he needed from town. The windmill was his second project. He spent 2 days figuring out why it wasn't pulling water properly, and then fixed it in an afternoon, which irritated her slightly because she'd been staring at that windmill for 6 months. He didn't make a point of it. He just said gear was stripped and moved on. He was sleeping in the barn, which he'd insisted on over her mild objection. He said it was appropriate, and she'd been too tired to argue the point hard. But evenings had begun to develop a shape. After Eli went to bed, there was a window, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour when the work was done and the dark was full, and there was nothing required of either of them. The first few nights, she'd stayed in the kitchen, and he'd gone back to the barn. Then one night, she'd forgotten to bank the fire before he came in from the last check on the cattle, and she was still at the table when he came through the back door. And instead of going straight through, he stopped and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. They didn't talk about anything important. He asked her how long she'd had the ranch. She told him it was Thomas's claim. Originally, she'd come west with him 12 years ago, believing in something that turned out not to be there. Told her about Missouri, where he'd grown up a mother who baked, a father who didn't stay, land that wasn't any good but that everyone worked anyway, because working was the only argument against despair anyone had found that was reliable. "Your mother teach you to bake?" she asked. "Some of it." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "Enough to know what you're doing wrong." She looked up from her coffee. "Excuse me? Your bread." He wasn't smiling exactly, but something around his eyes had loosened. "I watched you through the window this morning. You're fighting the dough instead of reading it." "Fighting?" She put her cup down. "My bread has been keeping this ranch fed for 2 years. "I know, I've eaten it." A pause. "It's not bad. It is definitely not bad. It could be better." The thing was, and she recognized this was irritating, he wasn't wrong. She'd never been taught properly. She'd learned by necessity, which meant she'd learned by failure, which was a real education but not always an efficient one. "All right," she said. "Show me." The next morning, before the cold set in, he stood beside her in the kitchen and walked her through the dough from the beginning. Not demonstrating she'd resented that before he even offered, had already prepared an argument against it, but talking her through it. What the texture should feel like at different stages. How the stove on the right side ran 20 degrees hotter. How long's was too long, and what it felt like in your hands when you'd gone past it. "There," he said, when she had it right. "That's the point you're looking for." She was aware of how close he was standing. She stepped back and checked the fire. "You should sell this in town," he said. "I tried. Hendricks at the Mercantile said he had a supplier." "Hendricks is wrong. Hendricks controls what moves through his store." "Then go around Hendricks." She turned to look at him. "Ride out to the neighboring ranches," he said. "Winslow bread at their doors instead of whatever's coming off the supply wagons. By April, you've got standing orders." She'd thought about something like that. She hadn't said it out loud to anyone because there was no one to say it to. "Where would I find the time? I'll cover the morning chores." "You're not going to be here, Gideon. You're a man who's running." That landed harder than she meant it to. She saw it in him, something that had been loosening tightened back up. "Right," he said, and he went outside. She stood at the stove holding the dough and feeling like she'd done something she couldn't exactly name, something small and irreversible. The riders appeared on the East Ridge on a Wednesday morning. Mara was at the well when Eli came running from the barn, with that particular kind of running children do when they've seen something a grown person needs to know about immediately. "Riders," he said. "Coming from town, I count 4. She looked east. 4 horses on the ridge, picking their way down toward the road that ran past Blackthorn's gate. She recognized the lead rider's build before she could see the face, the particular set of shoulders that meant authority, the way he sat his horse like he owned whatever ground it stood on. Sheriff Orson Pike. She'd met him twice. Once when Thomas had a dispute with a neighbor about a stray bull. Once when she'd gone to file a complaint about Bramwell Voss's men cutting across her land, and Pike had listened politely and then explained to her that without witnesses, there wasn't much the county could do. She dried her hands on her apron. "Go inside," she told Eli. But inside. "Now, don't come out until I come get you." She was at the gate when Pike reached it. 3 deputies behind him, 1 she recognized, 2 she didn't. Pike tipped his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who'd learned that manners cost nothing and bought a great deal. "Mrs. Winslow." He looked around the yard. "Place is looking better than I expected. I've been working hard." "That you have." His eyes moved over everything: the repaired fence, the windmill turning, the barn that was standing properly now. Calculating, same as Voss had done, but slower, more careful. "You must have found some help." She kept her face even. "I've been managing." He came back to her. "We're looking for a man. Came through this county sometime in the last 2 weeks, we think. Wounded gunshot, probably. Big man, dark hair, scar on his jaw." He paused. "You seen anyone like that through here?" The lie came before she decided to tell it. "No," she said. "I haven't seen anyone." Pike looked at her for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he looked at the barn. "Mind if my men take a look around?" Her heart was doing something unpleasant against her ribs. She kept her hands loose at her sides. "I mind very much," she said. "You don't have papers to search my property, Sheriff, and unless that's changed since the last time you were here, I'd like you to ask whatever you're asking and move on. I've got work to do." Something shifted behind Pike's eyes. "Respect, maybe. Irritation, certainly. You're right," he said after a beat. "I apologize for the suggestion." He replaced his hat. "If you do happen to see anyone matching that description, goes by the name Gideon Rourke, there's a county warrant for his arrest. Manslaughter charge out of Dawes County." He held her gaze. "He's considered dangerous, Mrs. Winslow. I'd take that seriously if I were you." "I'll keep my eyes open," she said. She watched them ride back up the ridge and disappear, and she stood at the gate until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then she turned around and walked to the barn. Gideon was standing just inside the door, in the shadow. He'd heard the whole thing. She could see it in him, the way he was looking at her, like he was trying to understand what she'd just done, and why, and whether she understood it herself. "You lied to a county sheriff," he said. "I'm aware." That was he stopped. Started again. "You didn't have to do that." "No, I didn't." She looked at him straight. "Now I want the truth. The whole thing, not the piece you gave me before. Because I just looked a lawman in the eye and lied for you, Gideon. And I did it with my son inside that house. And I need to know what I'm carrying." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sat down on a hay bale, slow, like the conversation was already heavy. "His name was Carl Decker," he said. "He ran a saloon in Dawes County. I was working cattle nearby seasonal hire. There was a card game. Decker accused one of the cowhands I worked with of cheating a kid, maybe 19 years old. Didn't have enough sense to cheat at cards, even if he'd wanted to. Decker went at him with a bottle. He looked at his hands. I pulled Decker off. It turned physical. He fell wrong angle, wrong floor. He didn't get up. She was listening without moving. County prosecutor called it manslaughter. He wasn't wrong. I didn't plan to kill anyone, but a man is dead and my hands were the last ones on him." He looked up. "I panicked. That's the honest word for it. I'd seen enough trials to know that what a jury hears and what happened aren't always the same thing, and I ran." "How long ago?" 8 months. "And you've been running since?" "Yes." The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted. The wind pushed at the boards. "Are you going to keep running?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. And when she left the barn and went back inside her house, he still hadn't. The trouble with Bramwell Voss was that he was patient. Mara had dealt with impatient men before, men who came at you, loud and obvious, who showed you exactly what they wanted and left no mystery about their methods. Thomas had been like that, in his way. Even Pike, for all his careful manners, moved in straight lines. Voss moved in circles. She'd known he wanted Blackthorn for 2 years. He'd made 3 separate low offers on the land, each one framed as a favor, as though he were rescuing her from something. When she'd refused, he hadn't pushed. He'd just stopped, gone quiet, withdrawn, left her alone for months at a time in a way that didn't feel like acceptance. It felt like waiting. She found out why in February. Eli came in from the morning check with mud on his boots and a look on his face that meant he'd seen something he didn't know how to explain yet. "Creek's different," he said. "Different how?" "Smaller. A lot smaller. And it's going the wrong direction up near the north pasture." She went out that afternoon. Gideon came with her without being asked, which she'd started to notice. He didn't volunteer for things anymore. He just appeared where he was needed and got quiet about it. They followed the creek north for half a mile, found the problem a quarter mile past the boundary of Blackthorn's land, a channel, newly dug, redirecting a significant portion of the flow to the east, toward Voss's land. Gideon crouched at the edge and looked at the work. "That's not a natural shift," he said. "No. When did this happen?" "Sometime in the last month." Eli would have noticed before. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at the diverted water. The implications were already organizing themselves in her head by summer. If the flow stayed reduced, the north pasture would dry out. Cattle would need to be moved or sold. The soil would crack. He's been planning this. "Voss, who else has land east of here?" Gideon stood up. He was looking north, past the diversion. With a particular expression she'd come to recognize, he was reading the land the way he read everything, carefully, like it had sentences in it if you knew the language. "There are old survey markers up that way," he said. "I noticed them when I was running fence checks." "I know. My claim goes to the creek. Your claim goes to where the creek was. Not where it is now." He turned to look at her. "Mara, if Voss moved the creek, and the county records show the creek as your boundary, then the boundary moves too," she said, "and I lose a quarter of my north pasture." The wind came down off the plain and hit them both, and neither of them moved. "He's been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Yes." She looked at the diverted water, thought about Eli writing letters to a father who wasn't going to write back, thought about the bread orders she'd started taking from the 3 nearest ranches, steady, growing, the thing that was finally beginning to feel like footing. "I need to stop it," she said. "Yes, I don't know how." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Let me look at those survey markers," he said. "All of them, not just yours. I want to see the full picture before we decide anything." She looked at him. "Gideon," she said carefully, "if you start asking questions about land boundaries and survey markers, people are going to see you. Pike is going to hear there's a big man with a scar on his jaw asking about Voss's property lines. I know, that's a risk to you. I know that too." He met her eyes. "But Voss is using the land against you. And I know land. He paused. "That's something I can actually do something about." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she looked at the creek. "Start with the markers on the Hendricks boundary," she said. "Those are the oldest ones. If Voss has been moving things, that's where he'd start, where nobody looks." He nodded. They walked back to the ranch together, not talking. The sun was low, and the shadows were running long across the grass, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing. She was halfway back to the house when she realized she'd started thinking in we. Not I. We. She didn't know how to feel about that, so she went inside and started on supper and didn't say anything about it to anyone. Gideon found the first marker 3 days later, then the second, then 4 more. He laid them out on her kitchen table, not the stones themselves, but the measurements, the notes he'd taken in a small notebook he'd produced from his coat, like he'd been carrying it the whole time. Sketches, distances, the numbers that told the story of what the land actually was and what was being claimed as what. "This marker," he said, pointing, "should be here." It's been reset here. He moved his finger 2 inches on the sketch, which meant, at scale, roughly 60 yards on the ground. And this one should be at the creek's original channel here. But the creek's here now, which means the marker and the boundary moved together. Mara leaned over the table, studying the notes. How many properties are affected? Yours, the Alderman place to your west, the Fitch family north of the ridge. Maybe 2 others I haven't checked yet. He looked at her. Voss hasn't just been moving your water. He's been running a squeeze across the whole north section. Small adjustments, gradual. Nothing obvious in any single year. Straightened up. How long has this been happening? Based on the growth on those reset markers? 3 years. Maybe 4, she thought about that. 3 or 4 years of quiet, patient theft. While Voss made his polite offers and waited. The other families, she said. Do they know? The aldermans might suspect something. Fitch, I don't know. They're newer to the area. Mara went to the stove and poured coffee she didn't particularly want just to have something to do with her hands. I need to talk to them, she said. That's going to take time to do quietly. And someone is going to notice you writing to all of them. Then I need to be careful about it. She turned around. Can you write up what you found? All of it? The measurements, the markers, the dates? Yes. In a form that someone could take to the county surveyor and have it verified? He looked at her with something new in his expression, something that wasn't quite surprise, but was close to it. Yes, he said again. I can do that. She nodded and set her coffee down and went to the window and stood looking out at the ranch that wasn't going to belong to anyone but her, not Voss, not the bank, not anyone who walked through her door without knocking. She'd made a decision somewhere in the last few minutes. She recognized it by the way her chest had settled, the way her hands had gone still. She was going to fight Bramwell Voss, and the wounded stranger she'd dragged off the frozen ground was going to help her, whether he was planning to stay or not. Outside, Eli was chopping wood. He was too small for the axe, really. But he was getting better. You could hear it in the rhythm, the way he'd stopped fighting the tool and started working with it instead. Mara watched her son and thought about how things that started badly could still end up being what you needed. The notebook sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Mara touched it again. Not because she'd forgotten it was there. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a bruise, not always thinking about it, but always knowing. Gideon's handwriting filled 12 pages. Measurements, bearings, sketches of marker positions with careful notations about soil disturbance and root growth around reset stones. The kind of documentation that took patience and a specific kind of intelligence, not book learning, but the kind that came from paying attention to land over a long time. She read it again on the 3rd morning while Eli was outside feeding the horses. Read it slowly, the way she read anything that mattered. Voss had been at this for at least 3 years, possibly 4. Small moves, careful moves, the kind that looked like natural drift if you weren't watching closely. A marker reset 2 inches here, a channel deepened there. The creek redirected gradually enough that no single season would show the change clearly, just a slow bleed, year by year, until the land you thought you owned was quietly somewhere else. She put the notebook down and sat with her coffee and thought about the 3 other families. The aldermen she knew well enough, decent people, older. Harold Alderman had helped her pull a calf in a difficult birth 2 winters ago and refused anything in return. Martha Alderman brought preserves at harvest. People you could talk to. The Fitch family were newer. Arrived 2 years ago from somewhere in Kansas with 2 teenage boys and a determination that hadn't yet run into enough hard weather to know what it was made of. She'd spoken to Clara Fitch 3 times, enough to know she was sharp and not easily fooled. The 3rd family was the Beaumont claim, north of Fitch's land. She'd never met them in person, only seen smoke from their chimney on still mornings. She was still thinking about the order of approach when Gideon came in from the barn and poured himself coffee without being invited, which he'd started doing sometime in the last 2 weeks. She'd stopped noticing it, which was its own kind of information. You're planning something, he said, sitting across from her. I'm thinking. Same result. Different pace. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The aldermans first. You have history with them. She looked up. You've been figuring this out too, she said. I've been thinking about it, yes. And? And you can't go to all three families at once. Someone will talk before you're ready. Voss has friends Hendricks, probably two of the county commissioners. Words gets back to him that you're organizing, and he moves faster than you're ready for. Mara turned the coffee cup in her hands. Outside, Eli's voice talking to the horses the way he always did. A running commentary on whatever was in his head. The habit she'd given up, trying to stop, because the horses genuinely seemed to like it. I need to go to town first, she said. For what? County surveyor's office. I want to know what the official record shows for those boundary markers. Before I talk to anyone else, I need to know exactly how far off the records are from what you found. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That means someone in town sees you asking questions about survey records, he said. Yes, and if Voss has someone in that office, then he knows I'm asking. Which means I need to move faster after that. She looked at him. Is the documentation ready? I need one more afternoon with it. To make it legible to someone who hasn't been standing at the markers themselves. You have until tomorrow morning. He looked at her with that expression she'd been seeing more of lately, not exactly surprise, but something adjacent to it, like he kept expecting her to be less than she was and kept being wrong about it. He didn't say anything, just nodded and finished his coffee and went back to work. The ride into town was 6 miles each way, and the road was frozen solid, which meant it was fast, but it meant every bump went straight up through the saddle into her spine. Mara made it in just under 2 hours and tied her horse at the rail in front of the county offices, while her back argued with her about the return trip. The surveyor's office was in the back of the building, past the land registry window, where a young man looked up at her with the particular expression of someone who expected to explain something complicated to a woman shortly. She didn't give him the chance. I need to see the recorded boundary markers for the following claims, she said, and put a list on his counter. Her land, Alderman's, Fitch's, the Beaumont claim, and Voss's parcels, all 4 of them. The young man looked at the list. Looked at her. That's quite a few. Yes, it is. I'll wait. He brought the records in 2 trips. She spread them on the counter and read carefully, making her own notes in the margin of a paper she'd brought. The numbers told a story, not the whole story, because the official record reflected what Voss had wanted recorded, but there were inconsistencies. Gaps. A boundary described one way in the 1,881 filing and a slightly different way in the 1,884 amendment. An amendment that had been filed by Voss's land attorney. She wrote down the filing dates and the attorney's name. Can I get copies of these 3? She asked, pointing. The young man looked at her. There's a fee. I'll pay it. She was walking out with the copies folded in her coat when she nearly walked into Dale Cutter, who was Bramwell Voss's ranch foreman and had the general appearance and personality of a fence post that had decided to become unpleasant. Cutter stopped, looked at her, looked at the county building behind her. Mrs. Winslow, he said. Mr. Cutter. A pause that lasted about 4 seconds longer than comfortable. Business in town, he said. Always, she said, and walked past him to her horse. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her the whole way down the street, and she knew that by supper time Bramwell Voss would know she'd been in the county surveyor's office. She pushed her horse harder on the way home. Gideon had the documentation finished when she got back. 12 pages had become 17, organized clearly measurements first, then the comparison to official records, then his dated notes on each marker site. He'd added a section at the back that cross-referenced the creek diversion to the boundary changes, showing how the two worked together as a system. She read it standing at the table, still in her coat. Cutter saw me at the county office, she said. Gideon looked up from where he was cleaning his hands by the sink. How long ago? 3 hours, maybe 4. Then Voss knows tonight. Yes. She set the papers down. How long before he does something? Depends on what he thinks you found. Gideon dried his hands and came to the table, looking at his own documentation with the dispassionate expression of someone evaluating their own work for weaknesses. If he thinks you only looked at your own records, he'll take his time. If Cutter told him you pulled multiple claims, Cutter was watching when I walked out. He knows I had papers. Then less time. He was quiet for a moment. You need to talk to the aldermans tomorrow. I was planning on it. Come with you. She looked at him. Gideon. I know. But Harold Alderman is going to have questions I can answer better than you can. About the markers, the measurements, what it means legally. You need someone who can speak to the technical side. If Voss has someone watching, he probably does. But if we wait for perfect safety, we wait until we've already lost. He met her eyes. It's your call, Mara. I'm just telling you what I think. She'd noticed he'd been doing more of that lately. Not pushing, not overstepping, just offering what he thought and then stopping. Leaving the space for her to decide in. It was a particular kind of respect that she hadn't expected from him and didn't quite know what to do with. You ride separately, she said. Come in from the north like you're checking fence. I'll arrive first and get Harold talking. You come in 20 minutes later like it's coincidence. That works, and if anyone asks who you are, hired hand. Seasonal. Came through looking for work, she nodded. Thin, but it was all they had. Martha Alderman met her at the door with an expression that mixed genuine pleasure at the visit with the cautious reading of her face that older ranch women developed the ability to see immediately that something was wrong and to decide in about 2 seconds whether to address it or let the visitor bring it up themselves. Martha let her in without asking anything, put coffee on, called Harold from the barn. Harold Alderman was 62 years old, built like a man who had spent 4 decades arguing with land and usually winning, and had the specific patience of someone who'd been surprised enough times not to rush the telling of things. He sat across from Mara at the kitchen table and listened to all of it. Creek diversion, the markers, what Gideon had found. He didn't interrupt, didn't react much visibly, just listened, with his big hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face. Gideon arrived 15 minutes in. Harold looked at him with the frank measuring look of a man who'd hired enough seasonal hands to read them fast, and Gideon gave him the slight nod of a man who understood he was being evaluated and didn't resent it. Sit down, Harold said. Gideon sat. Show me the measurements, Harold said. Gideon pulled out the documentation and walked Harold through it, point by point. Harold asked 3 questions, specific, technical, the right questions. Gideon answered them without padding. Martha stood by the stove and listened to all of it without speaking. When Harold finally sat back and rubbed his face with both hands, she said quietly, I told you the South Creek was lower. You did, Harold said. 2 years ago, I told you. Martha, I'm not arguing. I'm establishing a record. She poured more coffee into cups that were still half full, which was what she did when she was agitated and trying not to show it. What do you need from us? She asked Mara. I need you to let us survey your markers formally, with a witness. And I need to know if you're willing to bring a complaint to the county commissioner, jointly your name and mine both on the filing. Harold was quiet for a long moment. If Voss finds out we're part of this, he said. He's going to find out, Mara said. The question is whether he finds out when we're ready or when we're not. Harold looked at Gideon. What's your stake in this? I work for Mrs. Winslow, Gideon said, which was true enough and left enough unsaid. You do good work. Harold was looking at the documentation. These measurements, you did these yourself? Yes. All of them? All of them. Harold looked at his wife. Something passed between them, the kind of communication long marriages develop, fast and nearly invisible. We're in, Martha said before Harold could open his mouth. Harold almost smiled. What she said. The Fitch visit was harder. Clara Fitch was 34, had red hair going gray at the temples, and had raised 2 boys mostly alone, while her husband Franklin fought a losing battle with his lungs. Franklin was inside when they arrived. Mara could hear the cough through the walls, and Clara met them in the yard with the particular wariness of a woman who had too many problems already and was measuring whether these visitors were going to add to them. She listened to Mara with her arms crossed, looked at Gideon with unconcealed suspicion, looked at the documentation with the expression of someone who understood numbers and didn't like what these ones were saying. The south field, she said when Mara finished. Yes. I thought that boundary was off. Franklin said I was miscounting. She said it without bitterness, just a flat acknowledgement of a thing that had happened. You weren't miscounting. Clara was quiet. From inside the house, another cough, long and rough. Franklin won't be able to ride into town for any hearings, she said. I know. It would just be your name on the filing. My name against Bramwell Voss. Clara said it without inflection, testing the weight of it. Your name and mine, Mara said, and Harold Alderman's. Something shifted in Clara's face. Harold's in? Yes. Clara looked at Gideon again. Who are you? Gideon Rourke. I work the Winslow Ranch. You did this documentation? Yes, ma'am. It'll hold up? It should. The measurements are clean, and I can back every notation with the physical evidence that's still in the ground. Clara looked at her south field for a long moment. 2 of her cattle were visible near the fence line, grazing on grass that was sparse even for February. If we file and lose, she said, Voss won't forgive it. If we don't file, Mara said, Voss wins without a fight. Another long moment. Give me until morning, Clara said. I need to talk to Franklin. Of course. They rode back in the early dark, Mara and Gideon side by side on the frozen road, and for a long stretch neither of them said anything. The sky had gone a pale gray-green at the horizon, the particular color that sometimes meant weather coming. She'll do it, Gideon said. You think she already decided? She's just giving herself the night to make sure. Mara thought about Clara Fitch standing in her yard with her arms crossed, and her husband coughing in the house, and the south field being smaller than it should be. I hope you're right, she said. He was. Clara sent word with her older boy the next morning. Her name was on the filing. It was Eli, who noticed the men watching the ranch. He didn't come running this time. He came into the kitchen in the late afternoon and stood beside Mara while she was kneading bread and said, in a voice that was carefully flat, There's a man on the East Ridge. He's been there since noon. I can see him from the hayloft window. Mara kept working the dough. One man? Just the one. He's not doing anything. Just watching. She thought about Cutter seeing her at the county office. She thought about Voss and his patients and his circles. Does Gideon know? She asked. I told him first. He said to tell you. What did Gideon say he was going to do about it? He said, Eli paused, recalling. He said, let him watch. Watching isn't doing anything yet. Mara kept working the dough and didn't say anything. The man on the ridge was there again the next morning and the morning after that. Gideon was right that it wasn't action, it was message. Voss letting her know that he knew, that she was visible, that whatever she was planning, he was aware of it. She filed the documentation with Harold Alderman's name alongside hers on a Thursday, riding into town with Gideon beside her and not caring anymore who saw them. The clerk at the county commissioner's office took the papers with the expression of a man who had just been handed something he'd rather not have been handed and knew it. This is a serious allegation, he said. Yes, Mara said. It is. Mr. Voss has considerable. The documentation speaks for itself, Gideon said from behind her. Not loud, not aggressive. Just a simple flat statement. Clerk looked at him, looked at the papers, stamped them. Voss came to Blackthorn 4 days later. Not Cutter, not riders. Voss himself, in a clean coat on a good horse, with only one man behind him, a show of confidence. The particular contempt of someone who didn't think they needed reinforcements. Mara met him at the gate. Bramwell Voss was 55, thick-set, with a broad face that had probably been handsome once, and had gone to something harder and more settled with age and money. He had the eyes of a man who'd spent decades having things go his way and had started to believe that was the natural order. He didn't dismount. Mrs. Winslow, he said, pleasant, measured. We should talk. We're talking now, she said. He looked at the ranch behind her. The repaired fence, the working windmill, the barn that was standing solid. She watched him recalculate. He'd been expecting something more worn down than this. You filed a complaint with the commissioner's office, he said. I did, based on measurements made by a hired hand whose name I don't recognize. The measurements are accurate. They'll verify. They'll verify. He repeated it mildly, like he was tasting it. Mara, may I call you that? Mrs. Winslow, a slight tightening around his eyes. Mrs. Winslow, I've been patient with this property. I've made fair offers. They weren't fair, and I've respected your decision each time. But filing false allegations against my landholdings is a different matter. That's not something I can simply... They're not false allegations. She kept her voice even. The boundary markers have been moved. The creek was diverted. That's documented with dates and measurements, and I have witnesses who can confirm the same changes on their land. Voss looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant expression didn't go anywhere. It just went slightly more still, the way a water surface goes still right before something moves beneath it. "You've had help," he said, "from someone who knows surveying. Hired hand who just happened to have that particular skill set." He tilted his head slightly. "Interesting." She said nothing. "I'd be curious who that is," he said. "A man willing to help a widow make serious legal allegations against the largest landowner in the county. He'd have to be either very brave or very foolish. Or," he paused, deliberate, "someone who doesn't have much to lose because he's already lost it." The sentence sat in the cold air between them. He knew, or suspected, or was guessing and watching her face to find out. She kept her face still. "Whatever you decide to do next," she said, "the filing stands and the documentation is already in the commissioner's hands. Can't retrieve it." Voss looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned his horse. "Good day, Mrs. Winslow," he said, still pleasant, still measured. "Give my regards to your hired help." She watched him ride away and stood at the gate until he was gone, and then she breathed for the first time in what felt like several minutes. That night she told Gideon what Voss had said. He listened without moving. When she got to the last part, "Give my regards to your hired help," something in his jaw went tight. "He's guessing," he said. "Maybe. If he knew for certain, he'd have gone to Pike already. Unless he's waiting for a better moment, the way he does everything." Gideon was quiet. He was sitting at the kitchen table and she was standing at the stove, and the lamp was between them, and Eli was asleep in the back room. "Put you at risk," he said, "by helping with this." "You put you at risk. I made my own choices. Mara, don't." She turned around. "Don't apologize for the thing that's actually helping. Save it for something you should actually feel bad about." He looked at her. "You should be worried about yourself," she said more quietly. "If Voss confirms who you are and goes to Pike, I know. You could leave now. Take the evidence you've collected, give me copies, and go." Before he can put it together, he held her gaze for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" he asked. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove settled. Outside, the wind was picking up, and she could hear it pushing at the boards the way it always did in February. That low, steady pressure, like something trying to get in. "No," she said. "That's not what I want." He didn't say anything. She turned back to the stove. "But wanting things and what's smart aren't always the same thing," she said. "So think about it. Seriously. Don't just," she stopped. "Don't just stay because staying feels right. Think about what happens if Pike shows up with a warrant." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I'm not leaving until this is finished." She didn't respond to that. She didn't tell him she was relieved to hear it. She just banked the fire for the night and told him to make sure the barn door was latched against the wind coming in. He went outside. She heard his boots cross the porch. Heard the barn door, the latch, dropping. She stood in the kitchen in the dying warmth of the banked fire and understood, with the specific clarity that only comes when you've stopped arguing with something, that the man sleeping in her barn had become something she hadn't planned on and couldn't fully name yet, and that one of these days that was going to have to be addressed. But not tonight. Tonight there was the wind and the filing, and Voss's careful, pleasant voice, and the alderman's and Clara Fitch and the documentation sitting in the county office with her name on it, and that was already more than enough to carry. She went to bed and lay awake for a long time listening to the wind, and eventually, sometime past midnight, she slept. The bread was what changed things in town. She'd started the neighboring ranch deliveries, in late January 2 loaves at a time, riding out on mornings when Gideon could cover the chores. By mid-February, she had standing orders from 4 ranches. By the end of the month, 7. It was Ruth Danner, wife of the closest ranch east, who said it in the way that changes things, "Mara, I've been giving these to Hendrix's customers when they come by, and they want to know where they can get their own. You should have a place." Mara laughed. She actually laughed at that, standing at Ruth Danner's door with empty baskets. "I have a ranch to run." "You have a ranch and a bakery," Ruth said. "The ranch just doesn't know about the bakery yet." She told Gideon that evening. He said nothing for a moment. "Then she's not wrong. I can't run both." Not yet, he was looking at the table. "But if the legal filing goes through, and Voss is checked, you'd have the water back. The north pasture recovers. Cattle numbers stabilize. And you've already built the customer base. And you think I should, open a storefront? I think you should think about it seriously, instead of laughing at it. She looked at him. You're not wrong either, she said. That's getting irritating. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. I'll live with that, he said. It was the closest thing to lightness she'd seen in him, and it lasted only a second before he pulled his attention back to the coffee cup. Back to whatever he always pulled his attention back to when things got close to something. She'd seen it, and she filed it away without knowing exactly what she was saving it for. The commissioner's office sat on the filing for 11 days. Mara counted them. She wasn't the kind of woman who marked calendars obsessively. She'd always thought that kind of waiting was a form of self-punishment, but she found herself counting anyway. The way you count something when the not knowing is worse than any answer could be. 11 days of Voss's man on the ridge. 11 days of bread deliveries and fence checks and Eli doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, while Gideon repaired the barn roof 2 boards at a time. 11 days of ordinary life sitting on top of something that could detonate at any moment. On the 12th day, a letter arrived, not from the commissioner's office. From Voss's attorney, a man named Hartwell, based in the county seat, whose letterhead alone communicated that he charged more per hour than most ranchers saw in a month. The letter was 3 pages, formal and dense, and what it said, stripped of the legal language, was this. The allegations in Mara's filing were without merit. The boundary markers in question had been surveyed and recorded correctly. The changes to the creek's flow were a natural consequence of the previous winter's unusual precipitation, and if Mrs. Winslow persisted in making false claims against Mr. Voss's lawful holdings, Mr. Hartwell would be compelled to pursue appropriate legal remedies on his client's behalf. She read it at the table, read it twice, then set it down and went to the window. Gideon came in from outside 20 minutes later, saw the letter, and read it standing up. Counterfiling, he said. He's going to try to tie you up in a dispute long enough that the commissioner dismisses for lack of clear evidence. That's what I thought. It's smart. Hartwell's good, I've heard the name. He set the letter down. It's also expensive. Voss is spending real money to respond this fast. Which means we scared him. Which means you scared him, Gideon said. He said it simply, without emphasis, like it was just a fact. He wasn't expecting documentation that clean. He thought he'd been careful enough. Mara turned from the window. We need a lawyer. Yes. I don't have money for Hartwell's equivalent. No. But Harold Alderman might. Gideon leaned against the counter, thinking. And there's a man in Denton I heard about him when I was working cattle country, 2 seasons back. Name's Pryor. He's not fancy, but he's beaten bigger firms than Hartwell's on land cases. He knows the territorial statutes. You know a lot of people, Mara said. I've moved around a lot. He said it without apology, without deflection. Just the plain fact of a life that had covered a lot of ground. She looked at him. Would Pryor take this case? If we can get to him before Voss does, yes. He's the kind of man who likes winning cases the big firms say can't be won. Then one of us needs to go to Denton. A beat. I'll go, Gideon said. Gideon, it's 60 miles. I can make it in 2 days, see Pryor, and be back before the end of the week. He held her eyes. Voss's man on the ridge watches the ranch. If you disappear for 4 days, he reports it, and Voss knows something changed. If I go, I'm just a hired hand running an errand. It was logical. It was also the first time since he'd arrived that she'd be truly alone here. Just her and Eli. Without the presence she'd grown so accustomed to, she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound of a windmill when it's working right. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, she nodded, went back to the stove. Be careful, she said, which was not what she'd meant to say and was also exactly what she'd meant to say. I will, he said, and he sounded like he meant it. He left before dawn. Eli was still sleeping. Mara was up, had been up since 3 again, and she stood on the porch in the cold and watched Gideon saddle his horse in the gray pre-light. He worked quietly, efficiently, the way he always did, no wasted motion, nothing performed for an audience. He came to the porch before mounting. There's a loose board on the south fence, 3rd post from the gate, he said. Don't let it wait. The cattle will find it. I know about the board. and the stove runs hot on the right side, in cold weather hotter than usual. Watch your bread. Gideon. What? I've been running this ranch without you for 18 months. I think I can manage 4 days. Something moved in his face. Not quite embarrassment, more like the specific discomfort of a man who had just realized he'd overstepped without meaning to. Right, he said. Yes, sorry. Stop apologizing and go find us a lawyer. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he mounted and rode north toward the Ridge Road, and she stood on the porch and watched him until the dark took him. She fixed the south fence board herself that morning before breakfast. The 4 days had a particular texture to them. Not bad, not frightening, just different in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Like a weight she'd gotten so used to carrying that its absence changed her balance. She caught herself listening for him in the mornings. Caught Eli doing the same thing, glancing toward the barn at the times Gideon usually emerged. He'll be back Thursday, she told Eli on the second afternoon. I know. Eli was mending a harness strap with the careful, imperfect stitching of someone still learning. I'm not worried about him. You keep looking at the barn. I'm not looking at the barn. I'm looking at the hinge on the barn door because it's going to come loose again, and someone should fix it before it does. Mara looked at the barn door. The hinge was indeed looking questionable. Good eye, she said. They fixed it together that evening, Eli holding the hinge in place while Mara drove the new screws, and afterward they sat on the porch for a while in the cold, because sometimes sitting in the cold is better than going back inside to the quiet. Do you think he'll stay? Eli said. Mara didn't answer immediately. I don't know, she said. He fixed a lot of things. Yes. People who fix things usually, Eli stopped, working something out. Usually they either stay or they move on to the next broken thing. She looked at her son, 10 years old, and already building frameworks for how the world worked, most of them assembled from evidence that was frankly not great. A father who moved on, a ranch held together with wire and stubbornness. A fugitive who showed up bleeding and had become, without anyone planning it, the most reliable presence Blackthorn had seen in years. Some people get to choose where they stay, she said carefully. And some people have things that make the choice for them. Eli was quiet for a moment. Because of what happened. In the other county. Yes. Is that going to come back? She thought about Voss, about Pike, about the particular way Gideon had looked when she'd told him Voss was guessing at who he was that closed. Careful look of a man who'd been running long enough to know exactly how much a guess could cost. I don't know, she said. I won't lie to you about it. Eli nodded slowly. The hinge they'd just fixed caught the last of the light. He gave you his gun, Eli said, the first night. He did. I didn't understand it then. Eli looked at her. I do now. He was telling you he wouldn't hurt us even before he could prove it. Mara was quiet for a moment. When did you get so sharp, she said. I've been practicing, Eli said, entirely seriously, and went inside. Gideon was back Thursday afternoon, not Thursday evening earlier than she'd expected, which was the first sign. He came in fast, dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and Mara was already on the porch from the sound of the hooves because something in the rhythm of them was wrong. Pryor's coming, he said. He'll be here Saturday. He took the case. She exhaled. He can beat Hartwell? He beat Hartwell's firm twice in the last 3 years. He's not worried. Gideon was pulling the saddle, moving fast. But there's something else. Tell me. He finished with the horse and turned. I stopped at the county seat on the way back, checked the public notice board. He met her eyes. Voss filed for a lien hearing, 2 weeks from Tuesday. He's claiming you owe back fees on a water usage agreement, says, your husband signed a usage contract for creek access in 1883, and the payments lapsed when Thomas left. Mara went very still. Thomas never mentioned a water contract. Thomas may not have understood what he signed. A pause. Or Voss may have forged it. Either is possible. Can he do that? File a lien based on a contract I never knew about. Contract is in the county record, yes. He can file. Whether the lien holds is a different question. That's what the hearing decides. Gideon looked at her steady. But if the lien is granted before Pryor can get the boundary case heard, Voss can use it to apply pressure on Blackthorn's title. Complicate things. She turned away from him and stood facing the north pasture. where the creek ran lower than it should. Thomas. Thomas, who had walked out with a bedroll and an excuse. Thomas, who had signed things without telling her and left her to live inside whatever he'd agreed to. She had not thought about Thomas with anything other than exhausted relief in months. Now she thought about him with something sharper. "How long do we have to pull the contract record?" she said. "The filing office closes Fridays at 4. Pryor should be here by noon Saturday, too late for Friday. But Monday morning, first thing, we can get him in front of the original contract. And if it's forged, Pryor will know. He's seen it before." A pause. "Mara, this is manageable. It's bad, but it's manageable." Turned back around. Looked at him. "You keep telling me things are manageable," she said. "How do you know? I don't, always." He held her gaze. "But Voss is moving faster now than he was a month ago. Fast moves make mistakes. And he's using legal tools, which means he believes the documentation scared him enough to fight it in court rather than just dealing with it another way." "You mean threatening me. I mean making the problem disappear without paperwork." He said it plainly. "The fact that he's filing hearings and hiring Hartwell means he's decided to do this clean. That's better for you than the alternative." She stood with this for a moment. "All right," she said. "Saturday Pryor. Monday the contract record. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Gideon said, "I need to go back out to the Beaumont claim. I never got to their markers before Denton. If their land is also affected, Pryor needs to know before Saturday." She nodded. Looked at the horse he'd just ridden 60 miles on. "That horse needs a day," she said. "I'll take the bay." "The bay is half broke. I know," he almost smiled. "Good time to finish the job." She watched him go back to the barn and thought, not for the first time, that she was dealing with a man who moved toward difficult things rather than away from them, and that she still wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Pryor arrived Saturday at 11, which was an hour earlier than she'd expected, and in better humor than anyone riding that road in March had any right to be. He was 50, compact, with sharp eyes, and the quick, decisive movements of a man who'd spent his career in county offices and courtrooms, and had decided somewhere along the way that other people's crises were not worth absorbing emotionally. He shook Mara's hand like he was shaking a man's hand firm, once, done, and sat at her kitchen table, and read through everything in under an hour. When he finished, he tapped the documentation and said, "Who did these measurements?" "My hired hand," Mara said. "Gideon Rourke? Is he here?" Gideon came in from the back. Pryor looked at him the way Harold Alderman had looked at him measuring fast. "You did all of this yourself?" Pryor said, "Yes." "How do you know surveying?" "Worked for a survey company in Kansas for 2 years, before cattle." Pryor considered this. "You'll have to testify to the measurements at the hearing." "Beat." "I understand," Gideon said. Mara watched the space between that understanding and what it meant Gideon in a public hearing, under his own name, visible to anyone who came looking. She'd thought about it. She was certain Gideon had thought about it more than she had. "The water contract Voss filed," Pryor said, turning back to Mara. "Do you have any record of your husband's agreements from 1883? "I have a box of papers Thomas left. I haven't gone through all of it." "Go through it this afternoon. Every piece. Anything with a signature, bring it to me." He closed the documentation folder. "The contract could be legitimate. Husbands have signed things their wives didn't know about since before either of us was born. Or it's fabricated, which is a different problem for Voss and a different opportunity for us." He stood. "Either way, I need to see the original before Monday." She spent the afternoon on Thomas's papers, while Pryor and Gideon worked at the kitchen table, and Eli stayed carefully out of the way, doing his schoolwork in the back room with the particular sensitivity of a child who knows when the adults need the space. The box was everything Thomas had left behind when he went contracts, receipts, letters, a deed copy, a promissory note for farm equipment that she'd long since paid off herself. She went through it piece by piece, reading things she hadn't read in 2 years, the record of a life she'd spent building beside someone who'd apparently been planning his exit longer than she'd known. At the bottom of the box, under a folded survey copy from 1881, she found it. 1 page. Thomas Winslow's signature at the bottom, shaky he'd always pressed too hard with a pen. Dated March 1883. A water usage agreement between Thomas Winslow of Blackthorn Ranch and Bramwell Voss, granting seasonal creek access in exchange for a payment schedule running 10 years. She sat with it in her hands for a long moment. Thomas had signed it. He'd actually signed it. She brought it to Pryor. He read it once. Read it again. Set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man controlling his reaction. Payment schedule, he said. Look at the amounts. She looked. Those aren't seasonal access fees, Gideon said from across the table. He'd been reading over Pryor's shoulder. That's a purchase installment. He structured it as a usage agreement, but the payment amounts correspond to a land sale. He was buying the water rights, Pryor said, or trying to create a paper trail that looked like a sale after sufficient non-payment. He looked at Mara. Your husband thought he was signing a water access arrangement. Voss gave him a document that functioned as something else entirely. Mara set down Thomas's signature and looked at it. Thomas, who had been afraid of everything, who had probably thought he was getting a good deal on creek access and had signed without reading carefully, because reading carefully required admitting you didn't understand something, and Thomas had been too proud for that. Can we fight it? She said. The contract is real, but the representation wasn't, Pryor said. He was told one thing and signed another. That's actionable, not guaranteed, but actionable. He gathered the papers. It also explains why Voss moved on the boundary markers when he did. If the water rights paperwork was in the county record, he could start quietly changing the physical boundaries to match the land he was planning to eventually claim. Kitchen was very quiet. He's been building this for years, she said. Yes. He thought Thomas would eventually leave or fail, and then he'd have the paper to back up the land he'd already taken. That's what this looks like, yes. She stood up, went to the window. The north pasture was pale brown and bare, and the creek ran through it smaller than it should. I want to take him apart, she said. Not with anger she'd gone past the kind of anger that shakes. This was something quieter and more durable, completely. Not just the boundary case. All of it. The contract fraud, the markers, the creek diversion. I want the commissioner and the territorial court, and anyone else who should know about this to know all of it. Pryor looked at her with something that might have been the professional equivalent of appreciation. That, he said, is exactly what I'm going to help you do. The hearing was set for a Tuesday, and by the Monday before it, the town knew something was happening. Mara wasn't sure how information moved through a frontier town with the speed it did. It seemed to travel faster than horses, faster than letters, faster than any reasonable explanation. But by the time she rode in Monday morning with Pryor and Gideon, 3 separate people stopped her on the main street to say they'd heard about the Voss filing. And their tones were careful in the way that people's tones get careful when they're trying to figure out whose side it's safe to be on. She stopped for none of them. The county record office opened at 8. Pryor went in with the original contract and a territorial legal statute she didn't fully understand, but that Pryor had explained in the kind of patient detail that made her think he'd done this particular argument before. Gideon waited outside with her. The street was moving around them, wagons, horses, 2 women from the milliners watching from across the road. Are you ready for tomorrow? She asked. For the hearing? He looked at the street. Yes. Pryor says you'll have to give the measurements under oath. I know, if Voss has someone who recognizes you. Mara. He turned to look at her. I've thought about what happens if someone recognizes me. I've thought about it a lot. A pause. I'm going to be in that hearing room, and I'm going to give the testimony, and whatever happens after that happens. She studied his face, the scar on his jaw, the eyes that had gone somewhere far back since they'd arrived in town. Gideon. If Pike is there, then I'll deal with that when it comes. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not going to let Voss win because I'm afraid of what might happen to me. He stopped. I'm done making choices based on what I can get away from. That's how I ended up bleeding at your gate. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, like in agreement. Pryor came back out 20 minutes later with a look that meant something had gone well. The original survey, filing from 1881, predates the contract by 2 years, he said. And the 1881 filing shows the creek boundary explicitly. If Voss's attorney wants to argue the contract supersedes the survey he's arguing, that a private usage agreement can override a territorial land filing, and no court in this territory is going to sustain that. So the contract doesn't hold? The contract is a fraud built on misrepresentation, and it contradicts the territorial filing. We're going to crack it open tomorrow. Voss came to Blackthorn that evening. She almost hadn't believed it when Eli came in from the barn and said there were riders at the gate, and she'd looked out and seen Voss on his horse with 5 men behind him, not just Cutter this time, not the careful, confident display of 1 man plus 1. 5. People who looked like they'd been hired for something other than riding fences. Mara came to the porch. Gideon appeared in the barn doorway. Voss looked at Gideon for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara. I came to make a final offer, he said. Before tomorrow makes things difficult for everyone. I'm listening, she said. Drop the complaint. Accept the lien settlement. I'll reduce the amount by half. Call it forgiven as a gesture of goodwill. Sign over the north pasture and the creek access, and I'll leave Blackthorn's main holdings entirely alone. He said it pleasantly, like he was describing a reasonable business arrangement. Keep the house, the barn, the south pasture. You keep your bakery business. I take what I was already going to take legally, and we avoid an unpleasant public hearing. She looked at him. And the Aldermans, she said. The Fitches, the Beaumonts? That's between me and them. This offer is for you. You want me to abandon the families who came forward because I asked them to. I want to end a dispute that doesn't need to go as far as it's going. Still pleasant. Still measured. Think about your son, Mara. Think about what a protracted legal fight costs. Time, money, attention, and at the end of it, even if you win the boundary case, you still have the lien question. You still have minutes. Mr. Voss, she said, I know about the contract you had my husband sign. The pleasant expression didn't move, but something behind it did. I know what you told him it was and what it actually was. I know about the payment schedule you structured as a land sale installment. I know about the survey amendments your attorney filed in 1884. She held his gaze. I have the original contract, the original 1881 survey, and an attorney who has already explained to me exactly how those documents interact with territorial land law. The 5 men behind Voss had gone very still. I want you to take your offer, she said, and your riders, and go back to whatever you came from. And tomorrow morning, you and Mr. Hartwell are going to sit in that hearing room and listen to the evidence. Voss looked at her for a long, particular moment. Then he looked at Gideon, still standing in the barn doorway. Something changed in Voss's face. Rourke, he said. Quiet, certain. Gideon didn't move. Gideon Rourke, Voss said, louder now, loud enough that his 5 riders could hear it clearly. Wanted man. Manslaughter warrant, Dawes County. He turned back to Mara, and the pleasant expression was entirely gone now. You've been harboring a fugitive, Mrs. Winslow. That's a criminal matter. That's enough to have your land claim challenged on grounds of criminal activity. Ely appeared in the doorway behind her. And before Mara could speak, before she could do anything, Gideon walked out of the barn and across the yard, and he stopped between her and Voss's horse. You want to announce who I am? Gideon said. His voice was completely level. Fine. That's fine. But let me tell you what I found on your land while I was documenting those markers. Voss's eyes narrowed. You've got survey tampering that touches every homestead in the north section. That's not a civil matter that's fraud against the Territorial Land Office. That's federal jurisdiction. Gideon looked up at him on the horse, steady and unbothered. You go to Pike with my name tonight, and the evidence I've documented goes to the territorial marshal tomorrow morning instead of the county commissioner. And then it's not just a boundary dispute, it's a federal fraud investigation. The 5 men behind Voss exchanged glances. Voss's horse moved sideways. Voss controlled it, but his hands on the reins were tight. You have no authority, Voss said. I don't need authority. I need a mailing address for the marshal's office. Gideon held his gaze. Which I have. The silence was very long. This isn't over, Voss said. No, Gideon agreed. It's not. It'll be over tomorrow. Voss turned his horse. The 5 riders turned with him. Mara stood on the porch and watched them ride away, and felt something in her chest that was not quite triumph and not quite fear, but was right on the border between both of them. She looked at Gideon. He was still watching the road where Voss had gone, and his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "Were you bluffing?" she said. "About the marshal's address?" "Partly." He turned. "I don't have a mailing address. But the documentation would genuinely qualify for federal review, and Voss doesn't know I can't send it tomorrow. And when he realizes, he has to decide tonight whether to risk it. And tonight he doesn't know what we've already sent and what we haven't." He finally looked at her fully. "Tomorrow matters more than tonight." She nodded. "Get some sleep," she said. He didn't point out that she'd be no more capable of that than he was. He just went back to the barn, and she went inside, and Eli, who had heard all of it from the doorway, followed her in silence and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. "He walked right out there," Eli said. "Voss could have had him arrested." "Yes, but he did it anyway." She looked at her son. "Yes," she said. "He did." Eli was quiet for a moment. "I want to be like that," Eli said, "when I'm grown." Mara sat down across from him and looked at the table and thought about a man who'd run from one hard thing and walked toward another, and what the distance between those two choices meant. "Then work on it now," she said. "It doesn't start when you're grown." Eli looked up at her. "How do you work on it?" "You do the thing that's right," she said, "even when you're scared. Even when it costs something. You do it anyway, and you keep doing it until it gets less hard." She paused. "It doesn't get easy. Don't let anybody tell you it gets easy. But it gets less hard." Eli nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was putting something carefully away for later. She banked the fire. She checked the locks. She went to the window one last time and looked at the barn, where a lamp was still burning low. She stood there long enough that the lamp went out. Then she went to bed and lay awake thinking about tomorrow, and about a man who had stopped running at exactly the moment it would have been easiest to run, and about what that meant for both of them. The hearing room in the county building held maybe 40 people comfortably and had 60 in it by 8 in the morning. Mara noticed that first the crowd. She'd expected a formal proceeding, dry and procedural, the kind of thing that happened in front of a commissioner and 2 clerks and maybe a handful of interested parties. What she found when she arrived with Pryor and Gideon was a room that had filled itself overnight, ranchers and townspeople and women from the neighboring farms standing along the walls because the benches were already taken. Word had moved the way it always moved in small counties, fast, incomplete, and with enough accuracy to bring everyone who had a reason to care. Harold Alderman was there with Martha. Clara Fitch had come alone. Franklin wasn't well enough for the ride, and she sat in the second row with her hands folded and her jaw set in a way that meant she'd already decided how this was going to go and was waiting for the room to catch up. The Beaumont family, whom Mara had only recently met through Gideon's marker work, occupied the far end of the third bench, a quiet man named Walter, his wife, and a teenage daughter who was watching everything, who was watching with the focused attention of someone memorizing it. Voss was already seated at the respondents' table when they came in. Hartwell was beside him, neat and composed, papers organized in front of him, with the precise arrangement of a man who charged by the hour and wanted you to see it. Voss looked at Mara when she entered. He didn't look at Gideon. That was the tell, she thought. He was pretending Gideon wasn't there because he hadn't yet decided what to do about him, and pretending was easier than deciding in public. Commissioner Aldous Farrell called the room to order at 8:30. He was a cautious, deliberate man in his 60s who had the reputation of being fair in the specific way that meant he was slow to commit and hard to push, which was either a virtue or a problem depending on which side of a dispute you were on. Hartwell went first. He was good. Mara had expected good, and he was better than that. He presented the water usage contract with a fluency that made it sound entirely routine, described the boundary questions as legitimate uncertainties arising from natural land shifts, and characterized Mara's filing as the understandable anxiety of a widow managing a difficult property who had unfortunately been given incomplete information by an unqualified hired hand. Unqualified hired hand. She kept her face still. Beside her, Gideon's expression didn't change at all. Then Pryor stood up. He was not as polished as Hartwell. He didn't have Hartwell's suit or Hartwell's city manner, and he knew it. And she watched him use it, watched him place his papers on the table with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who didn't need to perform authority because he actually had it. Commissioner Farrell, he said, I'd like to start with the 1,881 territorial land filing for Blackthorn Ranch, which was recorded 4 years before the water usage contract, Mr. Hartwell just described. He laid both documents side by side on the commissioner's table. The 1,881 filing identifies the creek as a natural boundary. The 1,884 amendment filed by Mr. Voss's attorney. This amendment adjusts the described location of that boundary by approximately 60 yards. He paused. The amendment was filed by Bramwell Voss's land attorney, not by the Winslow family, not by any neighboring claimant. Solely by Mr. Voss's representation, Hartwell stood. The amendment reflects a corrected survey. We'll get to that, Pryor said pleasantly. Commissioner, I'd like to call Gideon Rourke to present the physical survey documentation. The room shifted. 40 people, 60 people, turning slightly to locate Gideon. Voss's eyes moved to him for the first time. Gideon walked to the front of the room. He stood at the commissioner's table and spread the documentation and walked through it with the same flat, careful clarity he'd used with Harold Alderman at the kitchen table. No drama, no argument. Just measurements, marker locations, dates, and the physical evidence of soil disturbance and root growth that placed the timing of the resets. He was in front of this room under his own name, and he was doing it steadily. And Mara thought about what Eli had said. He walked right out there and understood that this was the same thing, in a different form. Hartwell cross-examined him hard, questioned his qualifications, his methodology, his relationship to Mara, whether he had a personal interest in the outcome. You were hired by Mrs. Winslow, Hartwell said. You live on her property. I work on her property, Gideon said. Yes, so your testimony benefits your employer. The measurements either match the physical markers or they don't. Mr. Hartwell can hire his own surveyor and check every one of them. A sound from the room, not quite laughter, but something adjacent. Farrell didn't gavel it down. And where were you before you came to Blackthorn Ranch? Hartwell said. Question was too smooth, too prepared. Gideon looked at him. Various places, he said. Kansas, mostly. Nowhere in Dawes County? The room went quiet in a specific way. Mara's hands were flat on the table. I've passed through Dawes County, Gideon said. More than passed through, I'd suggest. Hartwell turned to the commissioner. Mr. Rourke is known to the Dawes County Sheriff's Office in connection with a manslaughter investigation. His testimony in these proceedings should be Mr. Hartwell. Farrell's voice was dry and measured. Is the Dawes County matter before this hearing? It speaks to credibility. It speaks to a separate legal matter in a separate jurisdiction. Bring me evidence that contradicts the measurements, or we move on. Hartwell's composure didn't crack, but it bent slightly. He moved on. The hearing ran until noon. Pryor presented the original contract, the territorial filing, the discrepancy in the 1,884 amendment. He called Harold Alderman, who testified to the changes on his own property line with the particular credibility of a 62-year-old man who had been on that land for 20 years and knew every inch of it. He called Walter Beaumont, who was quieter but equally precise. When it was over, Farrell recessed for deliberation. The room didn't empty. It just reorganized itself, people standing in clusters, voices low, the particular tension of a crowd that knows the outcome matters and hasn't gotten it yet. Voss stood with Hartwell near the window, and whatever they were discussing was quiet and private, and Hartwell was doing most of the talking. Mara went outside. She needed air that hadn't been breathed by 60 people for 3 hours. She stood on the building's front steps and let the March cold hit her face and thought about nothing in particular for about 2 minutes, which was the most mental silence she'd managed in a week. Gideon came out and stood beside her. Hartwell's going to try to delay the ruling, he said. Request additional survey verification. Pryor said he might. If Farrell grants it, this goes another month. I know. She looked at the street. But the filing is in. The evidence is in. Even if he delays, it's there. A beat. You did well in there, she said. I told the truth. That's not a skill. Telling the truth under that kind of pressure is absolutely a skill. She looked at him. Hartwell tried to run you off the road and you didn't move. He said nothing for a moment. He's going to go to Pike, Gideon said. After today, he doesn't have anything left to lose by it. I know. I know, she said again, quieter. I've been thinking about it. He was looking at the street. A wagon went past, the driver glancing at them with the frank curiosity of someone who'd heard about the hearing and was assembling information. If Pike comes before the ruling, Gideon said, the arrest might give Voss grounds to challenge the testimony. Taint the documentation through me. Pryor already thought of that. He said, the documentation is filed and witnessed independently arresting. You doesn't pull it back. But it muddies things. Yes, she faced him. Gideon. Is there anything we can do about the Dawes County charge? Anything at all? He was quiet for a long time. I could have surrendered 8 months ago, he said. I didn't. That's the sum of it. He looked at her. There's no clever solution. There's just what I did and what comes from it. She held his gaze. And you're all right with that? No, he said honestly. But being all right with it isn't the requirement. Farrell came back in 2 hours and 15 minutes, which Pryor said was faster than he'd expected. The commissioner sat down, arranged his papers, looked at the room. In the matter of the boundary complaint filed by Mara Winslow, Harold Alderman, Clara Fitch, and Walter Beaumont against Bramwell Voss, he said. And his voice had the particular flatness of a man reading a decision he'd written carefully and wasn't going to deviate from. This office finds sufficient evidence of improper boundary adjustment to warrant a full territorial survey of the affected claims. All boundary changes recorded after 1,881 in the disputed area are hereby suspended pending survey completion. Hartwell was on his feet. Commissioner, in the matter of the water usage lien filed by Mr. Voss against Blackthorn Ranch. Farrell continued. Without acknowledging the interruption, this office finds that the contract in question contains material misrepresentation and cannot serve as the basis for a valid lien under territorial statute. The lien filing is denied. The room made a sound. Not applause, something more involuntary than that. Collective exhale, a shift, people looking at each other. Voss sat very still. Hartwell was speaking, but Farrell had stopped listening. He stamped 2 documents and handed them to his clerk, and that was, in the way of official proceedings, that. Martha Alderman put her hand over her mouth. Harold put his arm around her shoulder. Clara Fitch didn't react visibly. She just unfolded her hands from her lap and placed them flat on her knees and breathed, and that was enough. Mara sat at her table and felt something she couldn't name clearly, not joy. Exactly, not the clean release she'd imagined winning might feel like. More like the moment after you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and you finally set it down and your arms are shaking, and you're not sure yet if they'll work right. She looked at Gideon. He was already looking at her. She wanted to say something. She didn't know what it was, couldn't have assembled it into words right then, so she just held his eyes for a moment, and he held hers, and that was enough for the time being. Then the room started moving, and the moment ended. Orson Pike arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Mara was at the hitching rail outside the county building, waiting for Pryor to finish filing the certified ruling copies, when she heard the deputy say the sheriff's name behind her, and she turned. Pike was on foot, which was unusual. 2 deputies behind him. He walked toward Gideon with the expression of a man who was doing something procedural and uncomfortable and intended to do it correctly regardless. Gideon Rourke, he said. Gideon turned. I have a warrant for your arrest, Pike said. Out of Dawes County. Manslaughter charge. I need you to come with me. Street had stopped. People who'd come out of the hearing had gone still. Harold and Martha Alderman, 20 feet away. Walter Beaumont with his daughter. A dozen townspeople who'd never had a direct stake in any of this, but were watching the end of it. Gideon looked at Mara. She stepped forward. Sheriff Pike, she said. Mrs. Winslow. His voice was not unkind. This is a lawful warrant. I don't have discretion here. I know you don't. She was looking at Pike, but she was aware of Gideon completely. The way you're aware of something even when you're not facing it directly. I know you're doing your job. She turned to Gideon. He'd already put his hands out, not behind his back, not yet. Just out, like an acknowledgement. Like he was meeting it rather than waiting for it to take him. It's all right, he said, to her. Not to Pike. It's not all right, she said. No, but it's what's correct. He held her eyes, Mara. Take care of the ranch. The south fence board, the one I fixed, checked the nail on the 3rd post. It's not to hold through another freeze. She felt something happening in her chest that she was not going to let happen in the middle of this street. "You're not going to tell me about a fence post right now," she said. "I'm telling you what needs doing. Gideon, I know." His voice dropped. Not private enough to be inaudible to the people around them. Nothing was private in the middle of a street, but quieter. More careful. "I know. But I can't fix what happened in Dawes County by standing in the street arguing about it. And you," he paused, "you have a ranch that's worth something now. Keep it worth something." Pike stepped forward. Gideon turned and put his hands behind his back. She watched Pike's deputy put the cuffs on, watched Gideon walk with them toward the jail without pulling, without arguing, with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided something and was going to be consistent about it. At the door, he looked back once. She was still standing where she'd been. She didn't wave, didn't call out. She just stood there and let him see her standing. The door closed. Harold Alderman appeared beside her. "You all right?" he said. "No," she said. "Fair answer." He stood with her for a moment. "Martha's at the bakery wagon across the street. Come have something. It won't fix anything, but it'll give you somewhere to stand." She went across the street with him because he was right that it gave her somewhere to stand, and Martha pressed a cup of coffee into her hand without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. The news from Dawes County came to Pryor within the week. Case was clean in its facts and ugly in its implications. Gideon had killed Carl Decker. Decker had been in the act of assaulting a young cowhand. There were 3 witnesses who'd been in the saloon, and 2 of them were willing to testify. The Dawes County prosecutor had built his case for manslaughter, and the witnesses complicated it. But Gideon had run, and running had costs that witnesses couldn't entirely offset. Pryor went to Dawes County himself. He came back with the offer, plead to the manslaughter charge, serve the sentence, and the flight charge would be dropped. No trial, clean record after time served. "How long?" Mara asked. 6 years. She put her coffee down carefully. "He won't fight it," she said. "It wasn't a question. He told me he wouldn't." Pryor looked at her. "He said the plea is honest, that he did what he's charged with, and that serving the time is the right thing." She looked at the kitchen table. At the chair Gideon had sat in dozens of times, the one across from hers, the one that was now just a chair again. 6 years, she said. Yes, she was quiet for a long moment. "Then that's what it is," she said. He was transferred to territorial prison in April, when the roads were thawed enough to travel. Mara didn't go to the transfer. She'd thought about it more than she'd admit, and decided that watching them take him in chains was not something she could do without it breaking something she needed intact. Eli went quiet for a week. Not sullen, just quiet, processing in the way he processed things, internally and thoroughly. He did his chores without being asked, and his schoolwork without complaint, and on the 7th day he came to Mara in the kitchen and said, "Can I write to him?" "Yes," she said immediately. "Write to him. Will he write back?" "I don't know. I think so." Eli nodded. Went to the back room and got paper, and sat at the table and wrote for a long time, much longer than she'd expected, his pen moving carefully across the page with the deliberate pressure of someone who wanted to get it right. She wrote her own letter that night. It took her 3 attempts to say what she wanted, to say in a way that was honest, without being the kind of thing that made it harder for him. She'd learned, from years of managing what was hard, that there was a way to say true things that helped, and a way to say true things that just transferred the weight. She settled on this, that Blackthorn was standing, that the ruling had held, that the territorial surveyors had come and confirmed everything, and that Voss's land attorney had filed for 3 separate appeals and lost all 3. That Clara Fitch had cried when the restored boundary was confirmed, not in front of anyone who counted, but Mara had been there. That the water was coming back to the north pasture. Slowly, but coming. She didn't tell him she was waiting for him. That felt like the kind of thing that made a 6-year sentence into a different kind of cage. Told him instead to use the time, to not waste it. To be the man who came out the other side worth something to himself, not just to other people. She sealed the letter and mailed it Thursday. The first letter back came 5 weeks later. His handwriting was smaller than she expected, cramped, like he was being economical with paper. He thanked her for writing. He said the time went slow, which she'd suspected, and that he'd found work in the prison workshop that kept his hands busy, which she'd also suspected. He asked about the north fence. He asked about Eli's schoolwork. He did not ask her to wait for him. She noticed that. She wrote back the same week. They found a rhythm. 2 letters a month, sometimes 3. His got longer as the months passed, less careful, less contained. He wrote about the other men in the prison, about which ones reminded him of people he'd known, and which ones surprised him. He wrote about what it was like to have nowhere to be, and nothing to do about it, which he said was the particular punishment of a man who'd spent his life in motion. He wrote about the young cowhand, the one he'd pulled Decker off of, said the kid's name was Arnie, that he'd been 19 years old, that he'd written to the Dawes County Court during Gideon's sentencing to say what had actually happened, for whatever it was worth. It had been worth something, Pryor had said. Not enough to change the outcome, but something. Eli's letters were different from Mara's, less careful, more direct, the way children are, when they haven't yet learned to manage what they say, to spare someone else's feelings. He wrote about the cattle and the horses and the things that broke and the things he fixed and the things he tried to fix and couldn't yet. He wrote about the bread orders and how the neighboring ranches were now calling it Winslow bread, like it was a category. He wrote about the South Fence Board told Gideon he'd checked the nail on the 3rd post, and Gideon had been right. It hadn't held through the freeze, but he'd replaced it himself and it was solid now. Gideon's response to that particular letter was the longest one he'd sent. He told Eli what to watch for in the spring, how to read the cattle's weight before the grass came in, how to judge whether the windmill needed the gear checked before it failed rather than after. He wrote it like instruction, but it read like something else, like a man reaching through a distance to do the only version of being present that was available to him. She read that letter 3 times. Spring came to Blackthorn with the specific generosity of a season that knows it has something to make up for. The creek ran full again. The Territorial Survey had ordered Voss's diversion channel filled, and the work was done in February, under a county supervisor's eye. The north pasture greened faster than it had in years. The cattle moved back into it slowly, suspicious of improvement the way animals are when they've been dealing with scarcity long enough. Mara expanded the bread orders to include the town itself. It happened because Ruth Danner had been telling her customers about Winslow bread for 4 months, and eventually 2 of those customers showed up at the ranch to buy directly. And when that happened twice in a week, she understood that the bakery wasn't a future plan anymore. It was already here. She rented a corner of Hendricks's competitor's shop, a small dry goods store run by a woman named Agnes Pohl, who had no love for Hendricks and considerable interest in foot traffic, and set up 3 mornings a week. Bread, rolls, the dense sweet loaf she'd developed in February by accident when she'd mixed up her proportions and produced something better than what she'd been aiming for. Agnes Pohl called it a happy mistake. Mara called it the result of understanding your stove well enough to work with its problems instead of against them. Business was not steady at first. It was lumpy and unpredictable, and she overbaked twice and underbaked once, and had a terrible week in May when her flour supplier changed without warning, and she had to adjust every recipe by feel. But she knew how to work with her hands, and she knew how to fail forward, and by summer the 3 mornings a week had become 5. And Agnes Pohl had given her the whole front corner, and was talking about knocking out a wall. She wrote to Gideon about the knocked-out wall. He wrote back, "Do it. Don't wait until it makes sense on paper." She knocked out the wall. The business that filled the new space surprised her. She'd expected slow growth. She got faster growth than she could easily manage, which was a problem of an entirely different quality than the problems she'd been managing for 2 years, and she was not ungrateful for the difference. Eli took on more of the ranch work, which he was old enough for now, and approached with the same combination of Mara's stubbornness and something that wasn't hers, a patience that came from somewhere else. He worked the cattle in the morning before school, and came home in the afternoon, and worked whatever needed working until dark. And he didn't complain about it. Not because he was trying to perform toughness, but because the work itself was satisfying to him in a way she understood, because it was satisfying to her too. On his 11th birthday, she gave him the bay horse, fully broken now. He named it Steady, which she thought was perfect. In the 2nd year, Voss's empire began to come apart. Not quickly, not with drama, Just the slow, unglamorous dissolution of something built on ground that wasn't as solid as it had been made to look. The territorial land fraud investigation, which the county commissioner had quietly referred to the territorial marshal's office after the hearing, following a letter from Pryor that Mara had not known about until after it was sent, had been working through Voss's holdings for months. The Dawes County parallels didn't help him. A man with a pattern across 2 counties was a different kind of problem for a territorial marshal than a man with a local dispute. Hartwell withdrew from his representation in April of the second year, which told Mara everything she needed to know about how the investigation was going. Lawyers like Hartwell didn't withdraw from clients who were winning. Voss sold 2 of his 4 ranches in the summer. Sold them fast, which meant at a loss. The 2 he kept were the ones with clear title, which was fewer than he'd thought he had. Mara heard this from Agnes Pohl, who heard it from the land registry clerk, who had apparently been unhappy about certain things for a long time, and was now in a position to express that unhappiness through information sharing. She wrote to Gideon about it. He wrote back, "I'm glad for the Aldermans, and the Fitches, and you. Not I'm glad Voss is getting what he deserves. Not satisfaction exactly, just relief for the people who deserved better." She thought about that. Thought about the kind of person who, after 2 years in territorial prison, wrote relief for other people rather than satisfaction at an enemy's fall. She folded the letter and put it with the others in the box under her bed. The box was getting heavy. By the 3rd year, the bakery was its own thing entirely. She had 3 people working with her Agnes Pohl's niece, who had her aunt's sharpness and twice her energy. A young woman named Dora, who was deaf in one ear and had the best sense for dough temperature Mara had ever seen. And a boy of 14 named Ike, who didn't say much but lifted flour sacks without complaint and kept the ovens clean. Paid them fair wages and didn't apologize for what she charged for bread. Pryor came by the bakery once, passing through town on another case, and stood in the doorway looking at the full shelves and the 3 employees and the line that had formed by 9 in the morning. "I remember when this was a corner," he said. "It still is a corner," Mara said. "Just a larger building around it." He smiled at that. "Rourke still writing?" "Every 2 weeks. Good man," Pryor said simply, and bought 2 loaves and left. She thought about that a lot. Good man. Said like it was a simple thing, a clear thing, and maybe for Pryor it was he'd seen enough of what men did when they thought no one was watching to have a straightforward view of what the other kind looked like. She thought about a man who'd handed her his gun the first night and told her to use it if she needed to. Who'd fixed her fences without being asked. Who'd walked out of a barn into a yard full of Voss's riders and said the things that needed saying. Who'd held out his hands to Pike without arguing. Good man was probably exactly right. It was just that right didn't make the 6 years any shorter. She went to him in the 3rd year. Despite what she'd told herself about not making the sentence into a different kind of cage, despite the practical impossibility of the distance she went. She told herself it was a practical matter. She was going to the county seat anyway to file the expanded business registration for the bakery, which was now officially Winslow Bread and Provisions, a name that had come from a customer who'd said what she sold was both, and she'd realized he was right. The territorial prison was 40 miles past the county seat. Practical, she told herself, all the way there. The visiting room was a single long table, with a bench on each side and a guard at each door. She'd expected something worse, and it was still bad enough. She sat and waited and heard the door on the far side, and then he was walking toward her, and she understood, with the specific clarity of something you can't unfeel once you've felt it, how much of the last 3 years she'd been organizing around this moment. He'd changed. Of course she'd changed too, in ways she was more and less aware of. He was thinner, and the prison pallor was on him, and he moved with the particular careful quietness of a man who had learned to be small in a space where being large had costs. But his eyes were the same. That was the thing, his eyes were exactly the same steadiness she'd looked at across her kitchen table 100 times. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other for a moment without saying anything. You said you weren't going to come," he said. "I changed my mind." "You're allowed to do that." "Yes," she said, "I am." He looked at her. A long, careful look, the kind that takes inventory not of what's in front of you, but of what's underneath. "The bakery," he said. Tell me about the bakery. So she told him. She told him about Agnes Pohl and the knocked-out wall and Dora with her one good ear and Ike who lifted flour sacks and didn't say much. She told him about Eli and the bay horse named Steady and the north pasture coming back green. She told him about the alderman's Martha's preserves, Harold's recovery from a bad chest cold in February. Told him about Clara Fitch, whose Franklin had died in the winter and who was managing somehow the way women managed things when they had no other option. He listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He just sat across from her and listened the way he'd always listened, like what she was saying was worth the full weight of his attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 3 more years, he said. Yes. He stopped, started again. The bakery will be bigger. Probably. He looked at the table, then back at her. I don't have anything to offer you, he said. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. Just the fact. I'm going to walk out of here in 3 years with a canvas bag and a manslaughter conviction and nothing much else. You'll have the skills you came in with, she said. Skills don't get in. She put her hands flat on the table. I didn't come 40 miles past the county seat to hear you tell me what you don't have. I know what you don't have. I also know what you do have, and I've had 3 years to think about which one matters more. He was looking at her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to wait for me, he said. I know you're not. You've been careful about that in every letter. She held his eyes. I'm not waiting for you. I'm building something. And when you're out, what you do about that is your business. But don't make decisions for me about what I should or shouldn't want. That's the one thing I won't have. The guard at the far door shifted his weight. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Something in him, something she'd watched be held very tight for 3 years' worth of letters let go slightly. The north fence, he said. Is it holding? Every rail, she said. He almost smiled. Got closer than he'd gotten in 3 years of letters. Good, he said. She rode home in the early dark and felt, for the first time in a long time, that things were moving in the right direction, even if the direction was slow and the distance was real and nothing about it was clean or certain. Eli was waiting up. How was he? Eli asked. She hung up her coat. Steady, she said. Eli nodded, like that was exactly the answer he'd expected. The last letter came in February, 6 years, and 2 months after the prison door had closed behind Gideon Rourke. It was short, shorter than any letter he'd sent in 3 years. Just a date, the 14th of March, and a single line, I'll be on the morning transport to the county road junction. You don't need to come. Mara read it twice at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd first spread his documentation, where Pryor had laid out the contract fraud, where Eli had written his first letter by lamplight with a pen too large for his hand. She folded it and put it in the box with the others. Then she went to find Eli. He was in the barn, working on a saddle strap with the focused patience he'd developed somewhere around 14 and never lost. He was 16 now, tall, with his mother's jaw and some quality in his hands that she'd never been able to identify the source of, like he'd inherited competence from the land itself. He looked up when she came in. When, he said. He'd known the release date for 3 months. March 14th. The junction. Eli set down the saddle strap. I'll go. He said we don't need to. He always says that. Eli picked the strap back up. I'll go anyway. She looked at her son, this boy, who had watched a man bleed on their floor at 10 years old, and had handed Gideon survey documents in a public hearing, and had written letters every 2 weeks for 6 years about fence posts and horses and bread, and understood that there were things Eli had settled in himself that she hadn't needed to be part of. Things he'd worked out quietly and completely, the way he worked out everything. Take the bay, she said. I was going to. She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen and thought about what it meant that she was not going herself. She'd made that choice 2 weeks ago, when the letter had still just been expected rather than received, and she'd made it cleanly. Not without feeling, but cleanly. Gideon needed to arrive on his own terms. He needed to come toward something rather than be received, which was different. She understood this the way she understood bread, not from instruction, but from paying attention long enough. She had work to do. She always had work to do, which was not a complaint but a fact about a life that had been built, rather than inherited, assembled piece by piece from what was available and what she was willing to carry. She went to the bakery. Winslow Bread and Provisions occupied what had once been Agnes Pole's small dry goods store, and was now a building twice that size. With a proper storefront window that Mara had argued against on grounds of cost, and eventually been convinced of on grounds of Agnes Pole, simply having it installed and presenting the receipt. Agnes Pole had died the previous winter quickly, without much warning, the way some people go when their body has simply finished its work. She'd left the building to her niece, who had immediately offered Mara a long lease at a rate that was below fair, which Mara had negotiated up because she didn't want a favor she'd have to feel about every month. Dora was already at the ovens when Mara arrived. Dora was 23 now, had been 23 now, and had been with the bakery since she was 17. And she'd long since stopped needing instruction. She'd developed her own methods, her own readings of the dough and the temperature, kind of instinct that can't be taught and only comes from enough hours of failure and attention. "You look like you're thinking about something other than bread," Dora said, without turning from the oven. "I'm thinking about bread," Mara said. "You're thinking about Rourke getting out." Mara tied her apron. "Is it obvious?" "Only because I know what you look like when you're thinking about bread," Dora said. "And this isn't it." Mara put her hands into the dough and felt the temperature, the texture, the particular resistance that told her where it was in its process. There was a comfort in this that she'd never expected when she'd first learned it, the way the work pulled you entirely into the present, away from whatever the mind was doing to itself. "He'll be at the junction by noon," she said. "Is Eli going?" "Yes. And you're here." "I'm here." Dora was quiet for a moment, turning a loaf with the deft confidence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "That's right," she said finally. "That's the right thing." Mara didn't ask her to explain it. She understood what Dora meant, that a man who had spent 6 years paying a debt needed to walk back into the world on his own feet, and that the woman he was walking toward needed to be somewhere he had to choose to go, not somewhere he was delivered to. She worked through the morning and didn't watch the clock. Eli was at the junction at 11:30. He'd ridden Steady, who was 7 years old now and as solid as his name, and he tied him at the post outside the small way station and sat on the bench outside and waited. The March air was cold but not cruel, the kind of cold that came with clear light, and the first suggestion, somewhere underneath it, that the season was thinking about turning. The transport wagon came at 10 past noon. 3 men got off. 2 of them were met by people Eli didn't know, a woman who hugged one man hard, an older couple waiting silently for the other. The 3rd man got off last and stood by the wagon with a canvas bag in one hand and looked at the junction road, and then at Eli, and then at Steady. He looked older. That was the first thing, not broken, not diminished, but older in the way that time in difficult places ages a person beyond the calendar. The prison pallor had faded, but something else had replaced it, a stillness that Eli associated with people who had spent a long time with their own company and made their peace with it. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. "You got tall," he said. 6 years, Eli said. "Fair point." Gideon looked at the bay horse. "That's not the same Steady. Same horse, just better fed." Gideon almost smiled. It was the same almost smile Eli remembered, close to the real thing but cautious about closing the distance. "Your mother," Gideon said. "Not a question exactly." "She's at the bakery." "A beat." "Right," Gideon said. And Eli could see him understanding it, the specific message in Mara, being at work, being at the thing she'd built, being somewhere he had to come to. "I brought you a horse," Eli said, "from the north pasture. His name is not Steady. He doesn't have a name yet, because I thought you might want to do that yourself." Gideon looked at the second horse Eli had tethered around the side of the way station, a dark roan with a calm eye and a good shoulder. "You brought me a horse," Gideon said. "You can't walk into town." "It's 8 miles and it's cold," and it would be Eli stopped. Reconsidered. It would be a lot of drama, showing up on foot after 6 years. "I wasn't going to walk. I was going to arrange something." "I arranged it." Eli untied the roan and brought him over. 4 years old, born on Blackthorn. His mother was the bay mare we had before Steady. Gideon took the lead rope. He looked at the horse for a moment, not the look of someone assessing an animal, but the look of someone receiving something they hadn't expected to be given and didn't quite know where to put it. He put his hand on the horse's neck. "Thank you, Eli," he said. "You're welcome." Eli untied Steady. "You ready?" No, Gideon said honestly. But let's go anyway. They rode the 8 miles mostly without talking, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who've conducted 3 years of a relationship entirely by letter and have already said most of the preparatory things. Eli pointed out what had changed on the road, a new homestead claim 2 miles east, a bridge the county had finally fixed after 3 years of complaints, the Fitch land where Clara had planted a new windbreak last fall that was just beginning to be visible as more than sticks. Clara's managing, Eli said. Your mother wrote about Franklin. 2 years ago now. She's managing. He paused. She asks about you sometimes. Through Mama. Gideon looked at the Fitch fence line. What does she ask? Whether you're all right. Whether you're coming back. Eli glanced at him. People around here know what you did. At the hearing, I mean. What you testified to, knowing what it might cost you. People don't forget that kind of thing. Gideon was quiet. I wasn't trying to make anyone remember anything, he said. I was just trying to do what was right. I know, Eli said. That's why they remember it. They came over the ridge that showed the town below, and Gideon pulled the roan up without being asked, looking at it. Eli watched him. The town was bigger than it had been 6 years ago, 2 new streets, a proper lumber yard, the school had been expanded. And in the center of the main street, visible from the ridge, the storefront, with the window that Agnes Pohl had installed over Mara's objections. The sign above it, reading Winslow Bread and Provisions in letters that had been painted by Harold Alderman's youngest son. Gideon looked at it for a long time. She built that, he said. Not a question, not surprise exactly. She built all of it, Eli said. The window was Agnes Pohl's idea. The wall was Pryor's suggestion. The name was a customer's accident. But the bread is hers. Everything that holds it together is hers. Gideon turned to look at him. You're proud of her, he said. Aren't you? Eli said, a pause, then yes. They rode down into town. She heard the horses before she saw him. She was behind counter when the sound came through the front window, 2 horses, on the main street, a particular rhythm, and she didn't go to the window. She stayed where she was, finishing what she was doing with a customer, counting change correctly, saying the right things. When she looked up, he was standing outside the window. He was looking in, not moving, not gesturing, just standing on the other side of the glass looking at the shelves, at Dora at the ovens, at the customer Mara had just served, and then at Mara. She held his gaze through the glass for a moment. Then she took off her apron, handed it to Dora without a word, and walked out the front door. Street was going on around them wagons, 2 men in conversation outside the hardware store, a child running with a dog. None of it stopped. The world was not particularly interested in the specific gravity of this moment, which was fine. This wasn't the world's business. He looked at her. 6 years had changed him in ways she'd cataloged from the visiting room 3 years ago, and ways she was cataloging now a gray at his temple that hadn't been there. A way of holding himself that was more still than she remembered, more deliberate. But the quality she'd identified the first night, the quality she'd never had an exact word for the thing that was not hardness, but was the result of hard things that was the same. Maybe more settled, maybe more certain of itself. Mara, he said. You look like you could use coffee, she said. Something happened in his face. Not the almost smile. The real one rare enough that she'd only seen it 4 or 5 times in the years before his arrest, and it still did what it had always done. That's probably true, he said. She took him inside and poured coffee, and they sat at the small table in the back corner that she used when she needed to review orders. And it was not the kitchen table at Blackthorn, but it was a table between them and coffee in both their hands, and that was enough of a foundation. He looked at everything. She could see him taking inventory of the shelves, the scale, the chalkboard where Dora wrote the day's available items, the ovens through the back door. It's bigger than I thought from the letters, he said. It grew faster than I planned for. Is that a problem? It was for a while. Now it's just the pace of it. She wrapped her hands around her cup. Ike is gone. He moved to Omaha last spring. I've got 2 new people. Sisters, actually. They argue about everything, and they're the most productive people I've ever had. He was looking at her with that full attention expression she'd always found simultaneously comfortable and slightly unnerving. You're good at this, he said. I'm getting good at it. There's a difference. She held his gaze. How are you? The true version. He considered it. She appreciated that he didn't give her the automatic fine, the social reflex. Unsettled, he said. I know that sounds I knew this day was coming for 6 years. I should be more organized about it. He looked at the table. But 6 years of knowing something is coming doesn't prepare you for it arriving. No, she said. It doesn't. I don't have I told you in the visiting room. I don't have much. I remember what you told me, and I remember what I told you back. She kept her voice level. I haven't changed my position. He looked up. Mara. I'm not the man you need. Don't, she said. It came out sharper than she intended, and she let it stay sharp because soft wouldn't serve here. Don't tell me what I need. You did that by letter for 3 years, and I let you because distance requires some amount of patience. But you're sitting in front of me now, and I'm not going to sit here while you argue me out of what I know. He was quiet. What do you know? He said. I know you fixed my fences when you were barely healed. I know you walked out of a barn at Voss's Riders. I know you handed Pryor 6 years of your life rather than run again. I know you wrote to Eli about windmill gears and cattle weight and fence nails from a prison workshop because you couldn't be here in person, but you could be here in the way that was available. She looked at him. I know what kind of man does those things. And I know it's not the kind who needs to sit here and tell me what he can and can't offer. The table was between them, and the ovens were going behind the wall, and the street was visible through the front window. He put his coffee down. I need to find work, he said. Real work. I'm not going to come to Blackthorn with nothing. Nobody asked you to come with nothing. I'm asking you to come. There's a difference. Yes, she said, and you're smart enough to know which part of it matters. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Dora appeared in the back doorway, looked at both of them, and disappeared again with the professional discretion of someone who had learned to read a room. There's a land parcel north of Blackthorn, Gideon said. I read about it in a letter Eli sent 2 years ago. The Beaumont family sold when Walter's health went. She'd wondered if he'd read that. It's still unclaimed, she said. I could work for the aldermans through spring. Harold mentioned in his letter last fall that he needed help. Earn enough to file on the parcel by summer. He was looking at the table, working it out. It's not Blackthorn. It's not, I'm not asking to. Gideon. He stopped. Do you want to come home, she said. The word landed between them home, with the full weight of everything it had accumulated over 6 years. The gate, the fence, the kitchen table, the letters in the box under her bed. Eli's bay horse named Steady. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Then that's where we start, she said. Everything else we figure out from there. He worked for Harold Alderman through March and April, which Harold accepted with the dignity of a man who understood exactly what was happening and was glad to be useful to it. He slept in the Alderman bunkhouse and ate at their table and worked from sunup past sundown without complaint, which Martha Alderman described to Mara as the most productive spring they'd had in a decade, and which Harold Alderman described more simply as having the right man for the work. He filed on the Beaumont parcel in May. Eli helped him survey it, the two of them spending a Saturday walking the boundary. Eli with a notebook, doing what Gideon had done 6 years ago at Blackthorn, measuring and noting and reading the land's history in what showed on its surface. It was a good parcel, smaller than Blackthorn, rougher, the kind that would take 2 years of work before it was genuinely productive. Gideon looked at it with the particular expression of a man calculating what was possible against what was available and deciding the gap was workable. The south end needs drainage, Eli said. I know. The well is shallow. I know that too. It's going to take... Eli, Gideon looked at him. I've been thinking about this parcel for 2 years. I know what it needs. Eli looked at his notebook. Right. Sorry. Don't apologize. Your reading of the south drainage is correct. Eli almost smiled. The Gideon expression, the almost, the cautious approach to the full thing had apparently traveled somehow in the years of letters and arrived in the boy's face. Mara had noticed it weeks ago and hadn't said anything because some things were better observed than named. They built the first structure on the parcel in June, not a house, a barn, because the barn was what made the land workable and the house could come after. Eli came every Saturday. Harold sent 2 of his hands for 3 days when the roof frame needed more than 2 people. Mara brought food and stayed longer than the food required. The second Saturday, she helped with the barn siding. She was not a natural carpenter. She knew this about herself and didn't pretend otherwise, which meant that she asked questions when she didn't know and paid attention to the answers, and by the end of the day, she was making fewer errors. Gideon didn't comment on the improvement. He just adjusted what he handed her and how he placed things and let her learn without the weight of his attention on the learning, which was the right way to teach someone who had been teaching themselves things for years and knew the shape of their own process. At the end of the day, they sat on the unfinished floor of the barn and ate what she'd brought, and the light came in through the open walls and made everything gold and approximate. "It'll be tight by winter," Gideon said, looking at what they'd done. "What remained? You have help. I don't want to owe." "Harold isn't keeping score," she said, "and Eli comes because he wants to. And I come because," she stopped, chose the honest version, "because I've been building things alone for a long time, and I'd like to try it differently." He looked at her. "That goes both ways," he said, "I know." Pause. The gold light moved as the sun shifted. "I'm not finished being rough around the edges," he said. "I know that too. I'm going to get things wrong." "Gideon, I have made every possible mistake a person can make with bread, and I have been running a business for 4 years. I am familiar with getting things wrong," she held his gaze. "What I'm not familiar with is someone who gets things wrong and stays anyway and tries to do better. She paused. "That's the part I'm interested in." He was quiet. "That visiting room conversation," he said. "You told me you weren't waiting for me. I wasn't. I was building something. And now? Now you're here and the building continues." She looked at the unfinished barn. "You're just in it." The barn was done by September. The house foundation was poured before first frost, which was ambitious and required 3 days of everyone Gideon knew working simultaneously, which turned out to be more people than he'd expected. Harold and 2 hands, Eli. Walter Beaumont's son, who was 17 and looking for a reason to be useful, even Pryor, who happened to be passing through and stayed 2 days because he said the case he was writing to could wait, and foundation work could not. Clara Fitch came with food and stayed to work, which surprised everyone, including Clara. "Franklin would have done this," she said, when Mara handed her a tool and raised an eyebrow. "Don't make a thing of it." Nobody made a thing of it. The house went up through October, slower than the barn but steadily. It was not a large house. Gideon had been precise about the plans room for one, with space that could become room for more if circumstances developed in that direction. He'd said this to Mara with the careful phrasing of a man trying not to assume, and she'd said, "Build it right," and he'd taken that as the answer it was. She was at the bakery the morning he moved in. He'd insisted she had orders to fill and employees counting on the day running the way it ran, and he'd said, "Don't change your schedule for a man carrying a canvas bag into an empty house." Compromised, she finished the morning and came at noon with bread and the coffee pot from the bakery that she'd always meant to replace and never had. He was sitting on the front step when she arrived. Canvas bag inside, fire going, she could see the smoke. The door was open. She sat beside him on the step and poured coffee into the 2 cups she'd brought and handed him one. They sat and looked at the land, the barn, the boundary fence that still needed the south section finished, the blackthorn roof line visible above the ridge to the south, the ranch that had started all of this, or had been the place all of this had landed, depending on how you told the story. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't. Not a debt. I mean," he held the cup in both hands. "I never properly said it. What you did that first morning. What it cost you to lie to Pike. What it cost to trust me when trust wasn't something I'd done anything to earn. You handed me your gun. It was, though." She looked at him. "You were scared and hurt, and you could have done anything, and you handed me your gun and told me to use it if I needed to. That told me what I needed to know." She paused. "The rest I figured out later." He was quiet. "I ran from the right thing and landed in the right place," he said. "I've thought about that for 6 years, what that means about how things work." "What did you decide?" "I decided it doesn't mean anything about how things work generally. It means something about what you did with it." He looked at her. "You could have left me at the gate. You could have turned me in when Pike came. You could have taken Voss's offer and kept the main land and given up the north pasture and had a smaller, simpler life with no risk in it. Every time there was an easier road, you didn't take it. She thought about that. The easier road, she said, didn't go anywhere I wanted to be. He looked at her for a long moment. Mara, he said. Gideon, I'd like to marry you. He said it simply, directly, without architecture around it. Not as a debt or a rescue or a I'd like to marry you, because you're the person I want to build things next to. The whole of it. She held his gaze. You're going to have opinions about my bread, she said. I already have opinions about your bread, and I'm not going to change how I run the business because you have thoughts about it. I know that, and Eli comes first. Always. Eli should come first. He's a better person than both of us. She looked at the land. Blackthorn's roofline on the ridge. At the barn they'd all built together. At the man sitting beside her on a step he'd built himself, holding coffee she'd brought, on land he'd filed, for honestly, with money he'd earned the hard way. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. That's what I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her, not dramatically, not with the large gesture of a man trying to mark an occasion, just the simple movement of a person closing a distance that had been too wide for too long. She leaned against him. They sat on the step and drank their coffee, and the October light came across the land at its low autumn angle and made everything look the way things look when you've been in the dark long enough to really see what light is. They married in November, under the cottonwoods at Blackthorn. Not a large gathering. Harold and Martha, Clara Fitch, who cried without apology and made no effort to explain it. Pryor, who rode 3 hours each way and said afterward it was worth it. Dora and the two sisters from the bakery, who argued quietly in the back about something unrelated, and then stopped when the moment required it. Walter Beaumont's son, who had never stopped showing up to help with things, and at this point Mara considered part of the furniture. And Eli, who stood beside Gideon. She'd asked him where he wanted to stand, and he'd said beside Gideon, without hesitation. And she'd understood that this was not a boy giving away his mother, but a young man standing beside someone he'd chosen to stand beside, which was an entirely different thing. The justice of the peace read the legal words, and they said what needed saying, and it was done in 20 minutes, which was about the right amount of time for a thing that had taken 6 years. Afterward, Eli shook Gideon's hand. Not a hug. A handshake firm, deliberate. The handshake of someone who had decided what kind of man he was going to be and was practicing it. Gideon shook back, equally deliberate. Welcome home, Eli said. Gideon's jaw moved slightly. Thank you, he said. For the horse, too. I never said that properly. You just did, Eli said. The gate at Blackthorn still had one repaired rail that Gideon hadn't replaced. He'd fixed everything else, the south fence, the barn siding that had warped in its second winter, the step on the porch that had been slightly wrong since before he arrived. But that one rail, the one he'd repaired in the first week after he'd been well enough to work, he left as it was. Eli asked him about it once, directly, in the way Eli asked everything without preamble, when he'd decided the time was right. That one, he said, nodding at the rail. Why do you keep it? Gideon looked at it. The repair was solid it would hold another 20 years. But it had the particular look of something done by a man who was working with what was available, the improvised quality of necessity. Because it was the first thing I fixed, he said. When I didn't know if I was staying or going. When I was doing something useful, because it was the only argument I had for being here. He looked at Eli. I want to remember what it felt like to do the right thing before I knew whether it would cost me or pay me. Before I knew how it would turn out. Eli looked at the rail. Does it matter? He said. How it turns out it matters, Gideon said. But it's not the part you control. He looked at the boy, the young man, 16 years old, and growing into himself in ways that were a daily small astonishment. You only control the doing. What comes from it is what comes. Eli nodded slowly. I'm going to remember that, he said. Good, Gideon said. They stood at the gate for a moment, both of them looking at the rail, and behind them the ranch stretched north toward the pasture where the creek ran full again, where the cattle had come back to grass that was green and deep, where everything that had been stripped down to its last necessity had been rebuilt not into what it was, but into something more honest. There is a particular kind of trust that can't be given at the beginning of something. It has to be built from the same materials as everything else worth having, from work, from showing up, from the small daily choices that nobody notices until enough of them have accumulated to mean something. Can't be rushed, and it can't be faked, and it absolutely cannot be purchased. It can only be earned, slowly, in the particular currency of a person consistently being who they say they are. Mara had learned this not from a man arriving at her gate bleeding, but from the 10,000 ordinary moments after that. From bread that got better because she paid attention. From a business that grew because she didn't wait for permission. From a son who turned into someone remarkable because she raised him inside a life that was hard and real and didn't pretend otherwise. And from a man who had spent the worst chapter of his life learning the difference between running from something and running toward it, and who had finally, completely, stopped running. Cottonwoods at Blackthorn put out their leaves in April, the way they always did, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath them. Creek ran. The cattle moved through the north pasture in the long evening light. The bread rose in the oven in town, and the sign above the storefront said what it said, and the letters in the box under the bed said what they said. And at the gate, one repaired rail stayed exactly as it was. Because a thing doesn't have to start out strong to become something worth trusting. It just has to hold.